And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas from already tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, we're going to rock this town.
Are we going to rock it inside out?
Rock it inside out. Make them scream and shout, as a
Mhm.
matter of fact. We have a fantastic presentation for you tonight. We're going to go about 2 hours with this X special report. This is Atlantis Rising, the Hot Zone, Edgar Cayce's vision of Poseidia and Earth changes, and why Poseidia is going to be so important in all this as a greater understanding of the period and the time that we're in. Of course, drawing through the individual of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet and the seer out of season, as it were. And quite interesting when we get into Cayce's work around Atlantis. Nothing beats him there, but we're going to draw on other sources tonight as well, including Annie Besant.
Fabulous.
One of my all-time favorites. And Besant did some extraordinary visioning of Atlantis, reading the Akashic record. We're going to get into that tonight as well. And also look at how the Earth changes aspect ties in with this idea of Atlantis rising. And Atlantis rising gets missed a lot in all of the literature around, anything having to do with ancient civilizations or whatever. You find a lot of emphasis around, hey, we found this or we found that. But the idea of a change taking place and the old lands reappearing is something that seems to have drifted off the map. Well, it's a central core in the mystery school teachings around Atlantis. That's why it's so important for us tonight to get into. We're coming off the heels of a fantastic documentary presentation that we had for you last week, which was the Apotheum UFO file, and just extraordinary. And it's interesting. It was a great lesson also in censorship, because we had a number of people who, when they got to it, it was just a black screen and all the rest. And because they were on that newsletter list, I was able to send them in real time another link via the newsletter. And it saved the day. And we had some fantastic feedback on that. We have it up on there, and that is Apotheum UFO File Wars, Vannevar Bush, Nikola Tesla, John Trump, and just an incredible overview on this. And make sure that you are on that newsletter list if you're not already, because as you can see, when they go deep on the censorship side, we're ready, because we have the backup, which is the newsletter part. And you're going to be seeing us really kind of reach out to present you with some fascinating documentaries more this year. And those documentaries also, the settings for those documentaries will become events as well. So this is a fantastic team that we have working on it. And one of the things I want to do is bring in the really deep aspects of what we're doing, and bring them into this election years in a way that we can reach as many people as possible with it. And so it's fantastic to go up into that level and just present it there for you. But the most recent one, and this is what we're calling now steganography cinema. And it is Apotheum UFO File Wars, of course, just previous to that, JFK 60, Blue Enigma. These are the presentations, and just wait for the things that we have coming up for you, including these documentaries, incredible, and I mean incredible, X-Series episodes, interviews, and it's all right there in the newsletter. And the newsletter, which you can get at darkjournalist.com, is free. So it just keeps you in the loop of the things that we're doing. And like I said, events also coming up as we get into this very fascinating year. Of course, the election is right in the heart of it all. But what I would say is it's a great opportunity, because we have a number of things coming up, and I think what's emerging really is just this incredible determination to seal the border, and so that the creation of this kind of invading army that the New World Order types are trying to use to intimidate the citizens here and drain the resources and try to collapse the society, as it were. It's only the person in that election group that's going to be able to, face that kind of scrutiny and stand up and say, I'm putting up a serious block against this and preparing to deport all the people that the Biden administration let in here to try to destroy the country. This is why the Biden regime is so dangerous and why we can't let the opposition be split, as we've seen on the Bobby and Trump side. The idea that they snipe at each other is totally a no-no, and both parties need to. I know that Trump has been actually complimentary of Bobby on a number of occasions, and the Bobby camp needs to do that. Also, really spell out how they would get to 270, because there isn't any logical way on the map to do that. What they can do is take that groundswell of support and merge it in with the Trump populism, and they can completely destroy the Biden regime. But if they split the throw the rats out vote, as it were, then you're going to have more of this, and the country can't take more of that, especially with the insanity. And actually, Stepford Biden was at the border stumbling around, and it was quite a sight to see, because they kept him very well protected, and he just looked like he was lost in La La Land. He certainly is not running the country. So once we remove him, we remove whoever is doing that, and that's going to be crucial. Yeah. Oh, no question about it. I think there's going to be different styles, and every candidate is going to have some drag in their past, or something along that line. But I think the whole election is going to come down to stopping the invasion of North America. And it's going to be really that simple. It's who constitutionally can uphold the border is going to be the person who deserves your vote. And but it can't be split. It's going to have to be, we're going to have to go in the direction of Trump. And unless the Bobby camp has some route to 270 that they're hiding out on, because it does not appear logical. And I have looked into other things, like the No Labels Party. This is very important, because Joe Manchin was the guy that everyone thought was going to run for them. And I thought they still might be holding out for him. But he said, oh, I have no interest in doing that. So they may be deep into selecting someone else, but they've done a much better job of getting on the ballot than Bobby Kennedy's campaign, which is surprising, because Bobby had all that money to do it. I think the Bobby Kennedy campaign, the independent effort, got started too late. And so it's kind of like too late, and maybe wait for 28 should be the slogan for Bobby's independent campaign, because I think it's a good platform. He's an excellent candidate. He has the ideas, but I've looked, I know political maps very well. There's no chance of him getting to 270. The only thing he can do in this scenario is stop either candidate from getting to 270. And what happens in that situation is it goes into the House of Representatives, and the House votes on it. And it's very easy to see that the Democrats in that case would, they'd vote carte blanche against Trump, and then you just need a couple of never Trumpers, and then the whole thing goes back to the Biden regime. So we had to be very careful and very logical, and not get just whipped up in sentiment about this, about, oh, we need to, fight the power or whatever. Who's going to be able to do it? If Trump is the only option in that sense of blocking this invasion, then he's the guy who should get the vote, in my opinion. And it's going to be interesting the way it comes down, because I think Bobby Kennedy's campaign has run on a number. It has not been focused, and it's ill run by Amaryllis Fox, who's a member of the Kennedy family now. But I think it is important to say that he has the right issues. But with the setup of the campaign the way that it is, it can't happen for 2024. And I do think there's a possibility of collaborating between Trump and RFK. And if you do that, you get something like 60% of the vote. So that's the kind of mandate going in I think you need. And that's what I think we're looking at here. There's always wild cards, but now that we're into March, it's pretty late in the campaign process for anything too wild to happen. The possible removal of Biden, with them putting in, I noticed Trump taking a shot at Gavin Newsom, calling him new scum, like that's new. So he must be hearing in the background that they're going to replace Biden with Newsom, who's one of the worst governors and politicians in history, and who threatened to call out martial law during the COVID op. Remember that? Love that guy during the UFO threat op. He'd just be like, stay in your homes, or we'll send our Nazi stormtroopers in heels after you. What I do feel also is that the Democrats are desperate. And what they're trying to do is create some idea that even if Trump gets in, that they have a way to stop him from being affirmed as president. So that's where the clash is, and that's where you see all the lawfare. There's a lot of lawfare cases against Trump that are collapsing. So this is important too. The Georgia case, which was supposedly the strongest case against Trump, is pretty much fizzled out because of the corruption of the leadership, Fannie Willis. And the only thing they really have left now is the Stormy Daniels New York case, which is always the weakest of the bunch. So whenever you're reading legal people around this, the fact that the Supreme Court is looking at whether they even have the ability to charge Trump is holding up those cases until the presidential race is over. So their lawfare strategy, they may have more to go. I know Chicago and Illinois, they recently took, the judge recently took Trump off the ballot in Illinois. I mean, the Democrats are going to win that anyway. But this is the nature of what you can see. So they're going to have to go outside of the normal channels of how you would win election, fighting on the issues or whatever, and just figure out some weird wild card thing. Like, can we throw this guy in prison? Can we bump him off? Or can we create a totally new precedent that says by the time he wins, that the Democrats just won't affirm his victory somehow. So those are the types of things where they would, have a backup plan for emergency powers. Whether they have the stomach for it, they certainly do not have the support. I would say the Democrat and Biden support are running somewhere around 30%, which you can't govern with. That's the nature of the problem that we find ourselves in, opening up into this expanse of election 2024, which we're going to watch very, very closely and believe this, which is the UFO file is going to show up right in the middle of this election. And whoever is on top of that issue, if Trump comes out and talks about it more, if Bobby were to do something more than, kind of superficial gestures about it, then both of them have a chance of really having that issue in their pocket. Otherwise, you're going to get this weird thing that we've been seeing, which is the CIA takeover of the UFO file. And God help us, the things that they could do, pretending that there's an invasion, pretending that they need all this protection, pretending that, they've made contact or whatever, all through the sick psychosis of the intelligence agencies. So this is very important on our side to be very aware of this going forward. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show tonight. Atlantis Rising, the Hot Zone. You know who the Hot Zone is, don't you? We've told you on this show. It's right in that area off the coast of Florida between Cuba and Bimini and the Yucatan Peninsula. And I've been told by a number of people who work in those areas over time, and we've done now 14 different shows on the Hot Zone. There's a whole playlist series that we have for it. But I've been told that if those people work down there, if they see something like ancient ruins, if you see a temple of Isis when you're in a submarine around Bimini, and you report it, if you work for the government, then that's a real no. You get court-martialed. If you work for a private corporate entity, you can get sued or worse. And so it's very, very heavy because there's a gigantic archaeological war involving the discovery and the bringing out of those ruins. And we know that they've been on the map for a long time, over 70 years. The biggest explosion, and we pointed it out, happened in 2000 with the Polina Zalitsky discoveries off the coast of Cuba. It's all very, very important. What I want to say is that in the background, a number of these mystery schools and mystery traditions were telling us this is what we were going into, the period that it was going to happen. But what's interesting, as I said, when we get caught up in discovery, what was the real theme of the discovery? The theme, according to the mystery schools, was all about not only a rediscovery of our past, but the fact that it was going to affect our future because those lands were rising again. And so land rising has to be just a core thing when you're looking at this from the esoteric vantage point. And as I said, I'm going to be going into Cayce's real deep version around Poseidia, which was right there in the Hot Zone, right where Bimini was, in fact, and the Bahamas Islands. That was all one huge piece. And it's very interesting when we get into some of that geography tonight in terms of that full continent of Atlantis much more than just some mythological story back there, a real history. And we have the ability to prove that, but we're under incredible censorship from academic levels in relation to this. And then you have weird false spins around things around Atlantis, around the UFO file, which what I call false disclosure. And often you see right in the center of it are the intelligence agencies manipulating those narratives. So it's very important, I would say, on our side to have a big jump on that. Before I go any further now tonight, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Good. Maddie Mosef says Atlantis is my favorite topic to discuss. I cannot wait. And Jessica Rodriguez says, I love when DJ and Olivia do shows on Atlantis and Edgar Cayce. These are my absolute favorites. So much esoteric mystery and wisdom in all of these shows.
Absolutely. Well, we really appreciate it. Look, the heart of the Atlantis story and why it's fascinated me for years is the advanced technology used as a means of spiritual intercommunication. So the fact that this process was betrayed in our ancient past and it completely obliterated the islands that formed the continent of Atlantis. And remember, Atlantis was one full continent, and we're going to read how it split into 3 islands that Cayce termed Poseidia, Aryan, and Og. But once it did that, the whole thing to go down was not a natural happening. It was something caused by this war between these 2 groups, the Sons of Belial and the Emilius group. And it's very important with the Emilius group as well, because they were the ones who hung in there and, through the initiates, developed this system for hiding those records in 3 different places. And it was Cayce who really put that on the record. But what's going to be interesting tonight is there are other writers around the 1930s who were picking up on this. They didn't have the detail of Cayce and they didn't have the insight, but they were starting to tune into this idea of the Sphinx and the Hall of Records piece. And so it suggests that the channeling that was coming through in that period was not just coming through for Cayce, but it was becoming right across the board. This is very interesting too, because we're going to find that theme of the Sphinx reemerging is also like this emerging of lands. And if you go into any depth reading around the esoteric subject, you're going to find the land rising aspect and how rising off the east coast of America is the crucial reference there. That this land, when it comes up, represents something totally new. And the idea that it isn't covered, that you don't hear National Geographic talking about land rising and things like that, gives you the hint that they're all over this, but they don't want average people and, people outside of that sphere looking into this because it's their baby. But this is one of the reasons why we have this esoteric tradition, putting it under our nose and saying, take a look at this land rising. I'm going to cite several sources in that tonight. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you have for questions out there? Anybody swing around?
Just getting back to political things for a minute. Genesis Trek says, does DJ believe Donald Trump has connections to the UFO file and UFO craft from his uncle Trump?
Yeah, well, we put on the record, and you can tell, because if you go previous to 2018 and you look at the documentaries about Tesla, there's all this reference about, his papers were gone through and all that stuff. But we're the ones who put on the record the depth of John Trump being involved and his involvement with Vannevar Bush and the UFO file connection. And so Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule, which is an episode we did 5 years ago. And by the way, we're coming up to a 6th year anniversary of the X series that we're going to do in about a month. So get ready for that. But it's kind of interesting when you think about it, because, and it really features heavy. If you want to know that part, it's in the Apotheum UFO file documentary we just did, trying to encapsulate those points. But Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule is a 3-hour overview of the whole thing. And there's no question that with Trump, there's this extra factor, because there's more, the battle, we've had people face off in battle before politically. The type of hatred of on the other side for Trump doesn't make him a hero. What I'm trying to suggest is that group doesn't like to face off with someone on the same level. So if they have someone there who through Roy Cohn, for example, is aware of where all the bodies are buried in the deep state. And on the other side, through his uncle, knows the Tesla UFO connection. And again, John Trump, through Vannevar Bush, who handled that, who managed it, and managed MJ12. Then you're dealing with a totally different thing. They don't want anything to do with that at that level, presidential level. This is the main reason why Kennedy was eliminated as well. So we have to look at these things much deeper, and we're in that period of time to do it. So when we understand the UFO file has nothing to do with, the nonsense that you have out there, the Corbell Carnival stuff, or any of the weird CIA people rolled out before Congress. And I've dealt with those people. Let me tell you, it has nothing to do with the UFO file. Whatever it is that they're up to, that is a program to bring forward this breakaway technology, and they want a story on top of it. And so they're trying to mill the public for that story. And they've borrowed a lot of elements that we brought forward in the show, interestingly enough. In the second half of tonight's program, we are going to take your questions in the ideas room. And so in about 45 minutes to an hour, we'll start taking your questions. And you can ask those questions of Miss Olivia, and she'll put them together as we go along tonight. I'm looking forward to doing that. And this is a nice special report for you. I'm going to open it up actually with dates. Now, what's interesting about these different periods of time is to try to get real direct hardcore dates from the people who are giving this information. So from Gurdjieff to Steiner to Cayce to Blavatsky, what are the dates that they're talking about? And do their dates line up? Very often they do. Occasionally there are wide gaps. But for me, the dates are crucial because they give us a timeline that's missing when we look at this. And we realize that when the original kind of apotheum happened, the destruction of Atlantis took place, what we see happening is that everything after that tries to take the technology, take the knowledge underground because of the destruction that it's caused. And all the knowledge of the Tuoi Stone, and that we're going to get into these power stations and things like that, that caused this basically, kind of massive EMP apotheum event. When you go back into that period, they need to keep it then under the initiates. They're the ones who would hold on to it. And this is something that Cayce gives us references for over and over again, that it's the initiates who will hold the technology after this period. So, but that period of amnesia that comes up afterwards, where we lose the technology and then they lose the knowledge, and eventually Egypt goes under, and the Greek civilization is there, but these things kind of wind down and we're left in the Middle Ages with nothing, basically. And what's interesting to me is lacking that timeline, and just, people taking wild guesses. Was it 10 million years ago, or 200,000, or 50,000? Like, what was going on? So not only have I been able to clarify a timeline, but I've been able to go into that timeline and say, oh, here's how it relates to a much deeper, older situation from this timeline. So traditional archaeology holds the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, for example, at 2500 BC, somewhere in there, with Khufu and all that story. But it doesn't add up. And the more information that we get, the more we can see the 10,500 BC date that Cayce gave lines up with a lot more, like archaeoastronomy and all the rest of it. However, if you go deeper, a level deeper than that, you can find in the Cayce readings that he starts talking about when they were looking for the spot to put the pyramid up with the Sphinx, the Great Pyramid, that they looked at the Giza Plateau because of its archaeology. So it was already an ancient sacred structure before they even put the pyramid or the Sphinx there, suggesting that the foundations there were much, much, much older. And at a certain point, we have Steiner talking about an Isis temple that was there, but he's going back 50,000 years earlier than this. So how long was that thread of Egypt, and how do they come around to doing this again? This is very important because we have layers and layers of information. So one of the dates that I want to start with is the Edgar Cayce reading where he talks about this death ray that they were using in Atlantis in order to get rid of all the gigantic dinosaur beasts. Now, traditional history has us destroying, the dinosaurs wiped out by a gigantic comet in 65 million BC. And what's interesting, the person who contributes to that is a major, major deep state player named Alvarez. And he's somebody who shows up in the Robertson panel with the UFO file. He's someone who shows up in the Zapruder film promoting the official version. And he's also someone who shows up using cosmic rays in the 70s to find secret passages in the Great Pyramid. That kind of a background track sets off all the X alarm bells. And I can tell you, I run into them fairly frequently. But so anyway, the story about the dinosaurs and the dating of the dinosaurs, hold it back there in your mind because it may not be as simple as all that. In any case, these gigantic beasts were overrunning everything in Atlantis. And so the nations of the world get together and have what Cayce termed a worldwide communication. And luckily, the questioner asked Cayce when the date of this was. And I'm going to get into this reading now. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, Atlantis Rising, Hot Zone, X, Edgar Cayce's vision of Earth changes and Poseidia rising. This is it. Going deep here with you tonight. And like I said, it's going to be a shorter report. So we'll be with you for about another 90 minutes and we'll take your questions in about 40 minutes. How's that? Okay, great. Okay. So he's going into this and they're confused with all the information he's given them. He's basically blown their mind. This is 1932. And they don't know what to do with this hardcore Atlantis information he's giving them. So they say to him, can you advise me regarding the preparation and the presentation for the great Congress held on the destruction of the enormous animals that once roamed the earth? And then Cayce answers, in the period when this became necessary, there was the consciousness raised in the minds of groups in various portions of the earth, much in the manner as would be illustrated by an all-world broadcast in the present day of a menace in any one particular point or in many particular points. And the gathering of those that heeded would be the scientific minds of the present day in devising ways and means for doing away with that particular kind or class of menace. As to the manner in which these gathered, it's very much as would be were the Graf Zeppelin to start to the various portions of those represented or were to gather those that were to counsel or to cooperate in that effort. Now, it's interesting because Graf Zeppelin, of course, those incredible ships that the Germans designed could go anywhere, and they had this terrible fire outcome, and so no one ever used them again. But they were thought to be the future of travel in that period. But he's saying in the earlier periods, he's saying, well, the Atlanteans were flying these people in, is the reference he's giving here. And he says, in that particular plane or sphere, in a land that has long since lost its identity except in the inner thought or visions of those that have returned or are returning in the present sphere, the ways and means devised were as those that would alter or change the environment for which those beasts were needed, or that necessary for their sustenance in that particular sphere of the earth that they occupied. And this was administered much in the same way or manner as they were sent out from various central power plants. That which is termed in the present day the death ray. Now, it's very interesting because it's Nikola Tesla who gives us the death ray term, and he wants to give that to the government as a way to protect them from this growing Nazi menace in that period. And in fact, when he dies, one of the things that they're looking for through all that material is information around this death ray. Where is it? And this was administered much in the same way as the death ray or the supercosmic ray, that which many are seeking into, which will give their lives much from the stratosphere or cosmic rays that will be found in the next 25 years. Now, you'll find over and over again Cayce going back to this date of 1958. And if you look at 1958, a number of interesting things are happening. because 1958 is the discovery of the laser, which is very Atlantean technology. 1958 is the International Geophysical Year, where we go and measure the magnetosphere. And guess what? We go to Antarctica. And Lloyd Berkner, is setting all this up. And Admiral Byrd, his last hurrah, is helping set it up. And underneath all this, as soon as we do it, we have satellites. So something happened in that period, and I've been bringing that forward in my IGY International Geophysical Year reports. We have a number of those coming up. They're going to show there was a gigantic leap in science there that was kept quiet, and it's part of the problem, shall we say, around the UFO file. But let's go back to Cayce here. He says, this presented then in such a manner as drawing upon the varied conditions that existed in the various portions of the land then occupied by man. What is the date BC of this gathering is the question. And Cayce answers, 50,722 BC. So now what happens is they set up this whole death ray thing to get rid of these giant dinosaur beasts. And what happens is through one reason or another, they decide, we're not going to use this right now. And the group inside of Atlantis that wants to use this for other purposes is the Belial group. And what they do is they hijack the process. So the process to fight off this menace, on one hand, was to put together all these death rays and get rid of them. Now they want to use the death ray for their own purposes for dominating every other land. That's where the setup and the main problem and battle that takes place between the Sons of Belial and the Emilius group becomes an actual war that goes on for years. In fact, the Sons of Belial win the war, but they've blown up Atlantis in essence. So this date is very important, 50,722 BC, because it correlates as we get into the whole Poseidia conversation with other dates that Cayce's going to put on the record. Then we're going to find Besant put certain dates on the record, including the fact that Poseidia went down in 9,654 BC. These are going to be crucial dates as we go forward here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is Atlantis Rising in the Hot Zone. Edgar Cayce's vision of Earth changes and Poseidia rising. We're going to be taking your questions here in part 2 of our presentation tonight. And
but you're going to answer my question right now.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I've heard you talk about this before, but what really caught my ear right now is that Belial won. So what does that mean about the survivors of Atlantis going to the way stations, to Egypt, for example? I mean, how many survivors were Belial versus Law of One, and did the Law of One, where did they go? How many of them did they go underground?
A lot of the Belial group sank beneath the waves because they were triumphant, but their lands were sinking.
Okay.
So in essence, it would be like a group exchanging kind of like a nuclear EMP situation here, claiming victory, but then the land was unusable.
Okay.
And this is a long process, over a 50,000-year process. So, when you think about it, it is interesting to consider the egress of peoples. What takes place when Atlantis goes down? Well, one of the things you find in the Cayce readings is the figure of Ra-Ta. And Ra-Ta is the priest who is from the Caucasus Mountains. And he is a transformational figure, very unusual. And Cayce describes him as a daughter of Zu, Z-U, without a human father. So we have to, nobody went in there and did the major follow-up on what not having a human father was all about. I mean, we're very aware in the case of Jesus, for example, but how is Ra-Ta not having a human father? Ra-Ta is a very interesting and important figure in all this because he comes in and he leads his group of 900 from that area in Iran down to Egypt. And the king in that period looks at them and says, I don't want to have a war with you guys. let's just merge these cultures together. And they do. And it's through Rata's psychic ability that has led him into this position. And then he spends 25 years with the Atlanteans planning out how to create the Hall of Records system so all the information is preserved before Atlantis goes down for sure. And there's a lot of intrigue around that. One of the things I want to say about Rata is he is that thread of the Emilius initiates, and that's why he gets together with them. So that whole plateau of the Giza Great Pyramid and all the rest is laid out by Rata and Hermes. Hermes, the Atlantean, super sensible being, very much. We have a number of these who come up at different times, but it seems like when that crucial part in history shows up, they have to appear. And that's where we get a number of these legends. I want to say also that Cayce's work is unusual. And I want to just give us this little background on Cayce. Many are familiar with him as the Sleeping Prophet. But his own connection to these events comes through his various reincarnations in Atlantis and Egypt. So it gives him this thread. And the people who come and ask for readings, when they get life readings, they've also had incarnations in Atlantis and Egypt. So it's like a soul memory coming around again. And what you'll find in the Cayce readings is he's talking about this period being a fulfillment where we get to face ourselves and our abilities with technology again, and the Atlanteans come in and transform everything. And so either it's going to be a great leap of advancement or total destruction. In Atlantis, it was for a while a great leap of advancement, and then it became total destruction. So we have to realize that when we come into this, he's giving us a terrific angle to look at this on, because it's just before all the high-tech stuff comes in. And here is Cayce giving us the layout for how this is going to go and how so much of it is a free will exercise, and that it's not so much technological advance. It's if you can advance spiritually to guide the technological advance. And so the groups that get together and, decide, well, we're going to move the culture forward with this and are coming from a spiritual angle, you might say, where are those groups in the midst of all the technological innovations that we're seeing? Right now, we have a very upside down situation where a number of the leadership on the corporate technological side is less advanced than the culture. So the culture is ready for, a number of things, advancements on the ground. And we have people like, Bezos and others who have no vision for humanity. They're just driven by profit. Or Zuckerberg, these groups get together and they want that kind of control right down to a soul level. And so their advancements represent extreme danger. What could be more like the sons of Belial than that? And so here's where Cayce is, again, incredibly prescient. And, people would call him the sleeping prophet. He didn't like the title of prophesying. But he left behind this legacy, and he gave us this message, comprehensive message, our own memory about Atlantis. I'm going to tell an interesting little side story on all this, which is, and this is where Bimini comes in. And I think people need to understand how crucial Bimini is going to be in all this, because it's just a little beautiful island out there, just a few miles, 30 miles off the coast of Florida. And Cayce identifies it now. Excuse me. No one had said anything about Bimini, not since the Celts or something. And the person who also put it on the map, Ernest Hemingway, as I've mentioned, Cayce did readings for him and his mother. So I'm thinking a lot of their attraction to Bimini was directly through that. And that's included in my HotZone reports. So the HotZone comes in with Bimini in this way, which is Cayce's looking at Bimini and saying, oh, this is a part of what was, this is basically like a mountaintop of what was once a great continent. But you know what else? Which is there's land rising here. So in a little period of time, we're going to rediscover our history, because this land is going to rise. And guess what? We're going to see that there was an advanced culture under the water, so that they had been flooded over. So it changes history dramatically. And Cayce's giving us that backstory. But before he gets into that, in the late 20s, a group of business people come together around him. And one of them finds him through this stockbroker, Morton Blumenthal, who was funding Cayce's efforts and had really discovered him. And Cayce found out that this guy, had been a prophet and things. He was an incredibly spiritual guy in the beginning. Later, he'll turn on Cayce and try to control him. And, he'll basically become his shadow self, as it were. Very interesting end to Morton Blumenthal's story as well. But for a while there, he was helping Cayce out quite a bit, and Cayce really needed it because he was coming in with his psychic abilities. He was being discovered. There were stories about him in the New York Times, his healing abilities and his ability to be a psychic diagnostician. There weren't things like that were going on in 1910, 1920. So, he was really unusual. And the fact that he could give these readings and use this advanced technique medically, people were just, they didn't know what to make of this. And it's quite fascinating. I have a number of those news reports. And when you look at them, it's unreal because they just don't know what to make of this guy. They were like, oh, is he like this miracle seer? What's going on? But Blumenthal starts to utilize him for business purposes and becomes even wealthier through the Wall Street boom of the 1920s before the crash, which Cayce accurately predicts. Now, that group that Morton Blumenthal introduces him to takes him to Bimini because they're curious about two things. One, how can we exploit this and make this like a tourist, Disneyland? That's one hand. And then on the other hand, they've heard a great deal about treasure that was hidden there by pirates and things like that. This is their story when they come to him, and he does a series of readings for them. But over and over again, his Atlantis vision and radar is coming up, and he's starting to talk about what's there. And there are only a few readings in the Cayce files. I mean, there are some that are missing from before Gladys Davis became his stenographer in, I think, 1920. So, he had done some travels and things, and some of those readings are lost and are gone, including the reading that he gave for Nikola Tesla in 1917. But what you will find is there are very few after that period that disappear. Well, Cayce gave a series of readings on Bimini, which had all this information about it being a major outpost of Atlantis and how right off the coast there was a temple that was rising. The second round of readings that they get disappear, and the copy disappears because the ARE always kept a copy, even in that period. So the readings that they get are unusual, I would say. And I think that someone deep in the financial system wanted to work this outside and didn't want any copies around of this. So that group disappears and shows up with a different name. When they go to contact them again in about 6 months, suddenly the company has a different name. So something very shadowy about the group that got in touch with them in the first place to do this. But nonetheless, he gave them the readings. And it's one of the few times where Cayce actually goes to the place and gives readings. So there's Cayce on Bimini giving the readings. Now, what happens is 3 years later, Cayce is taken to New York by Blumenthal and says, hey, there's a whole press series, a group of spiritualists and things. They want to hear you. Come out here and give us a talk. And so Cayce shows up and he does. And right in the front row, he sees the three business guys who he originally gave the Bimini readings for. And he's thinking, I can't wait to talk to these guys to see whatever happened to the research that they did with the readings and all the rest of that. I haven't seen them. And he's thinking, we're going to have a great catch up when it's all done. Then the lecture goes on. He talks about Atlantis. He talks about the past. He talks about psychic healing and things. It's over. He gets off stage and the guys are gone. They don't want to talk with him or follow up with him at all. They just are curious if he's going to mention anything in there that they can use again. So there's something very interesting going on in the back around Bimini as we get into this. And that feeds into the research that we've done around the Hot Zone. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Atlantis Rising. Hot Zone, Edgar Cayce's vision of Earth changes. And Poseidia, where does Poseidia fit in? Remember, Poseidia was where that Bimini to Cuba area in the Hot Zone is. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly in the ideas room. We'll go for about another half hour, and then we'll take your questions. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Nanette Chris says, DJ, the Tesla readings were allegedly recovered in his home country, but the Illuminati jumped on it.
Interesting. You hear strange things about that, and it's a good point. And it's interesting because I have Nanette's fantastic portrait of Rata printed out for tonight, but that's very interesting, Nanette. And I believe that somehow it isn't the kind of thing that would have been lost because of the people who were involved. So I think it was intentionally submerged. But it would be interesting to see if anyone got their hands on it. There have been, there was a group which said, oh, look, there are these readings for a 6-year-old boy, and it's actually a cover story. It's actually about Nikola Tesla. And they try to crisscross it with all that Scherf stuff, that we've heard so much about, which, so there's a lot of muddying of the Tesla story in terms of those readings. And Edison got a reading at the same time. So that's interesting too. And that one doesn't show up anywhere either. But could there be a group that absconded with the Cayce reading on Tesla? Yes, absolutely, 100%. I'm going to say this also about Cayce, which is he had a lot of pressure in his young life not to go forward and do his readings. He'd grown up in a Christian environment first in Kentucky, then in Alabama, then in Virginia. And they thought when he mentioned things like reincarnation or, traveling through the planets in your intermediate lives and different spiritual bodies and coming back to the earth, that was anathema to his Sunday school compatriots. Mm-hmm. So you have to imagine the guts that he had to continue on. And very often he would get dismissed from church activities once they found out, oh, this guy's giving psychic readings, get him out of here. And, he took terrible offense to it because it's well known in his background that when he gave teaching lessons for these Sunday schools, he always had incredible groups. He always had the biggest group in the church. So I just want to give us a snapshot there that at a certain point when his work gets abused, I've related this story before about this turbaned mystery school master that shows up out of nowhere and gives him advice and then takes off. They're very unusual mystical experiences. And he talked with several people about them. They're on record. And Harmon Bro, who was his assistant, a very young guy, related them some years later. But they are very, very interesting. And what happens is at a certain point when his father and this other doctor named Ketchum, there's that name again, we have this wonderful interlacing of names that come up over and over again. Jessup, Ketchum, and a series of others. And they're just absolutely fascinating. Moore is another one. Bloomfield. So he basically is like, you know what? I've had enough. Like, these people were using my readings for horse races and things. And that's why I was walking around with migraines for 6 months until the turban figure showed up out of the blue and said, get away from these people. You're with the wrong people. And Cayce was freaked out because, he's in the middle of a photo studio in Alabama. And this guy who looks like he's a Raja out of India shows up. So Cayce decides, you know what? I'm just going to do photography. Forget about the psychic stuff. And for a while that works out okay. And then his photo studio burns down. Then he gets into this whole thing about like, now I need to really come back. I'm going to commission this photography from New York and I'll try to sell their photographs to make the money back and all this stuff that he's doing. And then there's another disaster there. So anytime he tries to do anything other than the psychic activity over and over again, he gets involved doing discovering oil wells and things like that. His life goes in the dumpster whenever he gets away from his true path. And I think that's true of many of us. And in Cayce's case, here he is in the 1920s, and he comes back to his psychic readings. And it's in the middle of this process that the incredible Bimini and Atlantis readings really thrive. And it's really not until 1919 that where Cayce will really go in depth on the reincarnation side, astrology, and things of this nature. The readings before that were largely medical, and I think that's a crucial difference. Then we get this incredible 900 readings over time dealing with Atlantis, and they form the foundation for what we're reporting tonight, which is land rising and this amazing advanced culture that's they had their last sort of major burst of civilization right there in the Bahamas. And this is so very crucial because that area becomes then kind of right on the target, right on the bullseye. I'm going to go to some more quotes from Cayce. And speaking of Nanette Christ's incredible portrait of Rata, that is Cayce in a previous life as Rata, the Egyptian priest working with the Atlanteans to bring the Hall of Records to Egypt and place it beneath the Sphinx in the ceremony. I'm going to read about that ceremony as well and how that really is set up by the group that's running Poseidia, which is the advanced spiritual Amelius group called the Law of One. And, you know, there was a group, like a spiritualist group called Law of One, and that's, you know, what the reference is. I think we can take that Law of One reference so that it doesn't get confused and really just use that Amelius group tag because it's the same exact thing. Children of the Law of One, Amelius group, they're the same exact thing. The problem is that this channeling thing about the Law of One and all that, they just kind of grab the name and
Right, it's a catchy name.
It creates a lot of confusion. And people tell me, well, isn't that Edgar Cayce doing the Law of One books? No, he was, you know, Cayce died in 1945, and those books come from the late 70s, somewhere in there. And there was a lot of hanky-panky around manipulation of New Age information in those periods of the 70s and 80s. So, you know, you could see why they would pick up on something like that. All right, so we had one kind of hardcore date, 50,722 BC. Let's see, when we're talking about Poseidia, what are the kind of dates that are coming up? Okay, now, the islands of Atlantis, when they split up, are called Aryan, Og, and Poseidia. The Og group is the one who becomes dominant in South America. That's where a lot of the Inca groups will come from. The Aryan group will become major on the Spanish side and into the Pyrenees and things of that nature. And it's the Poseidians who move inland into Mexico, into Alabama, into Ohio. And it's quite interesting because I have an unusual discovery in the middle of the Cayce readings while I was doing this about the Poseidians going to Alabama. And it's funny because you find these very interesting standing stones and prehistoric monoliths all throughout Alabama, and nobody knows what to make of it. Well, now we can connect some of those dots. But before we get to that, he's talking a little bit about how do we get to this, you know, recognition of Poseidia. And he says, what is the land or country that was dominant in Atlantis? And he says, Poseidia from Atlantis. Now, he says, before that, we find the entity was in the Atlantean land when there were the constructive forces, activities of the children of the Law of One in all of these influences during the periods when the land was being broken up. We find this entity was the leading influence for the considering of ways and means in which there would be the preserving of records, as well as ways and means and manners in which either the few or the numbers might be preserved from the destruction that was coming to these lands. They knew it was coming. This is the interesting thing. So the Belial group sets up the Tuoi Stone in such a way, and by abusing it, basically, that it's starting to set off earthquakes, volcanoes, all kinds of bizarre effects. And he says, it would be well if this entity were to seek either of the three phases or ways and means in which the records of the activities of individuals were preserved, one in the Atlantean land that sank, which will rise and is rising again. That's Poseidia. another in the place of the records that leads from the Sphinx to the Hall of the Records in the Egyptian land under the right paw of the Sphinx. I have something so fascinating about the Sphinx tonight. I can barely hold back. And I want to point out that it is the right paw of the Sphinx. So I have people who email me and say, DJ, that's the left paw of the Sphinx. Look, I don't know if I've been reading the Cayce reading since I was 7. Like, it's the right paw. I don't know where the left paw thing comes from. It's the right paw. There it is in black and white. And another in the Yucatan land where the temple there is overshadowing same. This is important because in Yucatan, or what Cayce's calling Yucatan here, there is a Hall of Records buried beneath this temple. And he says, he's talking about, this person is in the interesting place of being able to tap into his past life memory and find it. And you'll find some odd references there when they ask him, who's going to find this Hall of Records? And he says, well, the individuals have to be purified, so first of all, don't expect someone to just stumble upon them. And then he says they have to get past those sentinels that are set as well. So you have to be, kind of divinely inspired. But at a certain point, he mentions that one of the people involved would be from the UK. I found that interesting because, having known Graham Hancock and his fascinating background on this and searching out for it, I found that interesting. Again, Cayce in those early days portrayed in the newspaper as kind of a marvel. How does this guy do this? And we need to keep that in mind also, because this is a person, regular person on one hand. He just has these incredible super sensitive psychic abilities and this incredible background in these different lives going through Egypt and Atlantis. And what happens is when he comes around to this period, his goal in life, or his purpose, his destiny, is to come through and be that channel for the mystery schools, getting this information out, because their earlier attempts through Blavatsky and through Theosophy created a foundation. And then you have Steiner's work. But there's something about the Cayce work around Atlantis, which I think gives us the most informative picture for the era that we're going into here. Although we can also say right side by side with it is Steiner's information on Ahriman. It's like they're tailor-made for the 21st century. I wanted to point this out, that there are a number of things that are being discovered that keep moving the timelines back, and they keep developing these kind of mundane explanations for what they are. Göbekli Tepe, everyone knows this, 12,000 years ago. Well, there's your 10,000 BC civilization right there. So it makes Cayce's timeline way more plausible, but they're finding them. This one was interesting. Stone Age wall discovered beneath the Baltic Sea helped early hunters trap reindeer. They call it the blinker wall. And it's quite interesting because they've discovered it underwater, and now it's visible, because they're not saying, oh, why it's visible, but it's visible because the land is rising and things are shifting. We're able to see them again. And their explanation is hunters tapped into the natural behavior of the animals and created their own linear feature for these underwater archaeologists. It's not an obstruction, it's a trail they follow to where the hunters are waiting. And the discovery named Blinker Wall is made up of 1,300 stones and 300 large boulders. They're placing the date here around 10,000 years ago. So those hunters, are supposed to be completely primitive and everything else, are constructing a 1,300 foot long, and right now it's 70 feet underwater in the Bay of Mecklenburg. But, as you can see, more and more of this is going to become visible, and so much of it is crucial that the information is right underneath the oceans, but it's in shallow water. So, for example, the Bimini Wall, which Cayce prophesied was going to be discovered, that's something that was discovered where anyone flying over it was starting to see it. It had come up. These things had been happening, but this isn't talked about. You don't hear that in science journals. Oh, there's land rising, and as a result, we're going to see things that are underneath that we weren't able to see before. It's completely left out. So land rising has to be just a crucial piece for us to get anywhere. And so there's a whole overview on that strange wall. I'm going to leave that, but you're getting the idea. I think there's something um, going on also in relation to the Spanish ruins underwater, relating directly to this Atlantean piece. And I think a big story is going to come out of that. But the biggest story, and I'm sure it's being heavily, heavily investigated undercover, is the Hot Zone story. That is where most of these ruins are, after all. All right.
Can
now,
I throw something out?
Yeah.
Okay, David Tremina says, DJ, the main plot to the 2010-ish film Superman Returns has Lex Luthor throwing Kryptonian power crystals into the ocean so he can create new land, real estate he would control. Crypto Atlantis?
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. I haven't seen that, but I would tell you, they know how to pick up on it, and they know it's coming. This is the interesting thing. So many of their plans that don't make sense, the fact that they're building things along the coast, and like the Obamas are, have a $20 million house on the coast and all that. If they believed half of what they were saying about climate change, they wouldn't be doing that. But what they know, the thing that is not talked about, is that those groups are very well aware of these changes that are taking place. What they're trying to do is get ahead of everybody. However, I would say that the quicker the message gets out about it, and the quicker as a culture we're aware of this, their ability to kind of lock up those ideas, that terrain, and the whole thing about land rising before we get to it, is far diminished. And that's why I think the mystery groups left it there. It's a very, very interesting thing to be able to watch it and study it as I do, and see all these things come up in relation to it, and have none of it be reported anywhere in the news. So that people, when I talk to them about it, they just don't have any awareness, very much like a number of these subjects. But this is an interesting one. So now here's an example about the Poseidian group going into America and leaving ruins. That's just a little gem hanging out in the Cayce readings. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is Atlantis Rising, Hot Zone, Edgar Cayce's vision of Earth changes and Poseidia. We're taking your questions here shortly. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. That's what keeps us connected, because we've had extraordinary censorship, including on our debut of our incredible documentary last week, which was the Apotheum UFO file. There's no better single episode on the Apotheum piece than that one. And within 5 minutes of the premiere, it was knocked out. So a lot of people had blacked out screens, and we were able to resend that newsletter out to them with the link again, and somehow, boom, everything was working. So you can see how important that is when this comes up. It takes literally a few seconds to sign up at darkjournalist.com. It's a free newsletter, but it gives us that direct pipeline and lets you know about the extraordinary episodes and incredible guests and documentaries and events that we have coming up for you. Very special things for you this year, which is the 6th year, believe it or not, of the X series. Just incredible. The other thing I want to mention is, while you're there, get behind the work that we're doing on this program. Stand up and be counted, subscribe to the show, and we've made it very affordable for you to get on board and do that. But your support is what makes the show go, and we appreciate it. Let's go to Poseidia by way of Alabama.
Okay.
Beautiful country. State exact location placed by me in another incarnation near Talladega, Alabama, where the healing waters flowed. Cayce answers, yes, in the site where the people were, the red men, the sons of La. And those peoples from the temple, as it were, in Poseidia. There we find, as indicated, the medicine man, the mystic, the sage, the teacher, made for his people a resting place. And he goes into this whole thing about a worship center. And then he says, much of it is faded and filled in, yet the camping site to the south and west of that known as Talladega may easily be pointed out by any. There upon the banks of that stream, now most hidden, where they be found the ruins of this. There the entity, the body in the present, seeks himself to know the possessions of the entity and where they would be found, there to stand in an understanding of brotherly love. So he goes into this whole thing about how this is important. And he does tell him, when the guy asks him, he says, well, what's there? And he says, well, there are jewels and there's gold and all this stuff that he placed there when he was part of this group that came from Atlantis into and formed this bond with the people who were there in Talladega. And it's very interesting because the guy gets very excited and is like, where can I find, the gold? And, he starts to flip out. And the Cayce reading source says, just follow the path of what you're doing. Don't worry about the treasure part. But it is in there, and I find it interesting. If you go into some of that Talladega archaeology, you're going to find there's some very interesting standing stones, right exactly where Cayce was talking about. And these early groups who were fleeing Poseidia, Atlantis, that had been burned out by the sons of Belial and was sinking beneath the waves, made their way into America and formed that network of standing stones where they could measure whatever it was they were measuring with these incredible megaliths. But I find that the location of that one interesting there. Right here, that would be the area that Cayce was suggesting. And then when you think down here, they come up through Florida, straight up into Alabama. I think that should be explored much deeper, as Cayce said. Well, a group of the Poseidians actually went there. Let's go a little bit deeper on this. Now, when they're talking about the Poseidians making plans to go into Egypt, he starts making terms and talking about first water Atlanteans and a new race. So this thing about first water Atlanteans, they are coming in and they are kind of a purified spiritual group. This is the part of the Amelius group. The Poseidians who are preparing for a regeneration of a new race. This is something that's hidden, that's just hanging out in the Cayce readings. Let's explore it a little bit. The entity was of the Atlanteans who did not favor the activities of the leader of the Atlanteans in rebellion. It brought questionings of his peoples, but with the reestablishing of Rata and those in order for the regeneration of the peoples for a new race, which was part of the experience of the entity in Poseidia. The entity became the supervisor of the excavations, studying the old records in preparing and building the House of Records for the Atlanteans. That's the Hall of Records, House of Records, as well as part of the House Initiate or Great Pyramid, the House of the Initiates. That's what it's for. That's what it's referred to. These colors that presented and represented the various periods, as well as the interpretations of Rata and Hermes, the wise men of the period, were placed with this entity. Ajaxal is his name. In the experience of the entity, he rose to greater authority, and they gave him the instructions. What's crucial in that reading is he's saying, this guy is being sent in, and he's studying records and archaeology. They're doing archaeology on this plane, and they figure out this is the perfect spot where we're going to put the Sphinx. Well, this is very interesting because it's already old. And the dating that he's giving when they ask him, when's the construction of this? Well, Cayce says the Great Pyramid took 100 years to make, and it wasn't made with a bunch of slaves. It was made with the same type of technology that causes stone to float in the air. This is part of the Atlantean legacy. But it's from 10,490 BC to 10,390 BC. That's when we have this being made. This individual studying the plains before it's set up is looking into archaeological records, which means the Giza Plateau and what's there beneath is much, much older. That's why they selected the spot. So we have two levels of dating history back. The first level is we take the normal academic level of 2500 BC, which never made sense to anyone who was serious, for the Great Pyramid. Cayce takes you back 8,000 years before that. All right. They try to ridicule that whole thing on the academic side. But now, as we can see with things like Göbekli Tepe, it's way more plausible. So there's 8,000-year jump. That's the first jump. What's the next jump? Casey's saying, well, this is the area they put it in. They did archaeology on it. That's already going back. So what are you going back? 30,000 BC, 40,000 BC? This is how we need to be looking at these things to get a handle on exactly the nature of it. A little further here on Poseidia. Now, land rising. Poseidia is what's rising. That's the first piece to come up. In that experience, the entity was among the Law of One, the Emilius group, then, who accepted and forsook much of those activities because of its close association and companionship with one of the sons of Belial. And the sons of Belial did this, which is they would intermarry and they would come into the Emilius group and they would kind of hijack their people. So there's a lot of these stories that come up like that. And they could say, hey, look, we do all the same stuff. We use the Tuoi Stone, we do all that, but we're having a great time with it. And you are kind of, studying as almost an ascetic, being set up as a temple priestess to receive these messages. Let me swing you over to this side. And I think a lot of this took place in that period. So Cayce says this brought consternation to this entity and also those influences and applications of use of which brought destruction to the land of Poseidia. Poseidia will be among the first portions of Atlantis to rise again. Expect it in 68 or 69, not so far away. That's when they find the Bimini Wall. That's right off the coast of Bimini. That's where Poseidia is. This is the connection directly. But Poseidia is the last stand. It's the last great land of the Emilius group. And they were still interfacing with the technology, reaching out to the saintly realm with it. And the Belial group had discovered, hey, this thing is great for dominating your neighbors. And, we're going to rule the world with it. So now when we move and take this knowledge about where they're placing the records in Egypt, they're placing the records in Poseidia, and they place the records in Yucatan. What's unusual about the placement of those three places? And you think about it. Remember, the three records are the same. So the Hall of Records Temple is placed in Egypt, it's placed in Poseidia, and it's placed in Yucatan. What's missing? What's odd about this? What's weird is Poseidia is going to go underwater. So why would they do that? Why would you place the Hall of Records where it's going to go underwater? The only reason you would do that is if you knew the exact spot was going to come back up at a certain point and humanity was going to be able to get their hands on it. Otherwise, the other two make sense. Yucatan and Egypt, they're going to be around. They're not going to sink beneath the waves. But
was Cayce ever asked that explicitly?
No. This is kind of connecting the dots on his readings. And if you look at Poseidia, it is right off the coast there. It's part of that whole Bimini Hot Zone area. So they must have known about these earth changes coming. And that's the thread that we get through the mysteries. That's the part which is a crucial missing link for us when we look now into the Atlantis story. And Poseidia and the laying of the records into the temple in Poseidia, which are the same records that are underneath the Sphinx. Why are there sets of three also? There's an interest in that. They all will be revealed at the same time and they will all match. Now, another thing that's included in the records, according to Cayce, is the construction of the Tuoi Stone. And the ability to set up the whole Tuoi power network is in that Hall of Records. This is why, in my opinion, a lot of the archaeological wars in the Hot Zone take place. If you go back, and I've mentioned this about the infiltration of the Cayce Institute in 1964 by these undercover CIA people, and that's a declassified CIA document now. So they had gone in there not looking to bust the Cayce people as commies or something. They were trying to find out about the Hall of Records. They wanted to know if there was anything inside that wasn't being shown publicly. This was a very interesting piece to them. Well, the intelligence agencies have gone abroad looking for things like Noah's Ark, and there's the whole thing with Dr. Farrell in the Giza Death Star about this inventory of Sumerian weapons that they had to bury because they couldn't be destroyed. They were so dangerous, and how that relates to an unusual incident that took place during the Gulf War.
Isn't this just more sort of this? We know about the CIA and the Nazis and wanting the Spear of Destiny and all of these.
Yes.
Yes, I mean it's
The
just
sacred object.
they're
Yeah,
looking. They're looking for power,
right.
and they're looking for sources of power from history
Hmm.
and possibly hidden physics.
Yes,
Mhm.
that's exactly right. And Hitler himself had gone into that famous museum in Austria and taken the Spear of Destiny with him. And of course, the reason this was supposed to have such a magical property is it was supposed to have been pierced the side of Jesus as he was on the cross. So the Nazis kept incredible close track of these sacred objects. But if you go into certain parts of the world, the understanding that a saintly object or something that's been magnetized by a saint has a different property in reality than other things, you're getting into the deeper basic understandings about what is known at a kind of initiatory level. So they're asking Cayce here, what about the setup of the Great Pyramid? Like, can you date it for us? And Cayce is saying, this was in the period as given, 10,500 years before the entering of the Prince of Peace into the land to study and become an initiate in and through the same activities that were set up by Hepsut. Now, Hepsut is very important for the setup of the Giza Plateau. That mystery school initiation center was operational from 10,500 BC directly to Christ's time because Christ went there as part of an Essene group to be initiated with John the Baptist. They both go there and they go through what was the initiatory practice of the time, which was dying for 3 days and coming back to life. That's what the initiate process is all about. And Christ will do that not as just an initiatory ritual, the way the various brotherhood members will do in those mystery schools, but Christ will actually enact the real thing after he's crucified. Now, a lot comes up here about the Hall of Records because Cayce has now indicated the Hall of Records is beneath the Sphinx right paw, but he's also suggesting that it encompasses all this information. They're trying to figure out exactly what's in there, and they ask, give in detail what the sealed rooms contain. And Cayce answers, a record of Atlantis from the beginning of those periods when the spirit took form and began the encasements in the land and the development of peoples throughout their sojourn, with the record of the first destruction and the changes that took place in the land, with the record of the nations or lands and the activities in the destruction, and how it became necessary for the final destruction of Atlantis, and the buildings of the pyramid of initiation, with who, what, where would come the opening of the records that are as copies from the sunken Atlantis, for with the change, it, the temple, must rise again. That's the Poseidian temple I was just referencing. So they're laying it out when they're doing these estimations on the initiatory level when they first place the Hall of Records and with the Sphinx. They realize, the Poseidian temple, that whole area, when we seal it up, it's going to go down, yes, but it's going to come back up. And that is the area directly in the hot zone. And then he says, for they are as copies from the sunken Atlantis, for with it the temple must rise again. This in position then in Egypt lies as the sun rises from the water, the line of the shadow of light falls between the paws of the Sphinx that was later set as a sentinel or guard for the Hall of Records, which may not be entered from the connecting chambers from the Sphinx paw, right paw, okay, that settles that one, until the time has been fulfilled when the changes must be active in the sphere of man's experience again. Between then the Sphinx and the river. You see how this changes things too. So when we're looking out at the Sphinx and the mysteries that are contained in the Sphinx, it's the entrance that's below the paw. The actual hall itself is in a pyramid of its own between the Sphinx and the river. underground. This is the thing that hasn't been entered, but somehow the way it was set up, the tunnel entrance, the entire entryway to the whole thing comes from the Sphinx. So we get a lot there if you go just a little bit deeper, just sifting down into what Cayce is telling us. And we get a whole lot about the Poseidians and what they were doing and how they knew this area was going to rise again. But Bimini, as it were, becomes the focus because that's where the Hall of Records temple is rising as well. And there was a lot of noise in, let's say, around the period of 1998 to about 2007, where it seemed like the Hall of Records was going to be discovered there, and you had guys like Bivol and Graham Hancock and some real heavy hitters there who were aware of this, and they got eventually, for a while, booted off the Giza Plateau because the people who were in charge, like Hawass and people like that, represent that chokehold of humanity that wants to keep these things just for a certain group. And so, on one hand, they take money from the Cayce Foundation for explorations and things, and on the other hand, they take the entire story that Cayce lays out for Egypt and says, "Oh no, it's completely untrue." So we know that the Sphinx was redated with the work of Robert Schoch, and the geology suggested that the weathering on the Sphinx. This is early '90s. How the culture hasn't moved on this already is beyond me. But the weathering of the Sphinx took place because of rains, and rains didn't happen unless you go back to about 10,000 BC. Well, that's when Cayce said it was set up. So these things do line up. If you what's mind-blowing about it is just how accurate Cayce is there in trance in the middle of all this. And we're going to discover that there were other mystics who were looking in on this and finding the same thing from a different angle. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is Atlantis Rising, the Hot Zone, Edgar Cayce's vision of Earth changes. We're going to be taking your questions here very shortly, about 10 minutes. And I want to remind you, if you're new here, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter. It keeps us in touch and gets us past this kind of intense censorship that we've looked at. And whenever we do shows, there's always some level of censorship. And, people are always saying, "Oh, I don't get notified," or when I search your stuff, it doesn't come up in Google or YouTube. How is that possible? But we've seen it, and I've had people study it and all the rest of it. One expert told me that I was on the level 85 out of 100 in terms of censorship. Well, 100 is just you disappeared, but 85 is you really kept to the fringes. And there's a reason for that as well. But nonetheless, with your help and with our direct communication in the newsletter, we don't face that problem. And I'm still standing, as they say. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Richard Hastings says, could Antarctica help us to understand Atlantis? And Happy Camper says, could Atlantis be within Antarctica? Because Antarctica was 1,000 miles north of where it is now before the last magnetic pole shift. So could the Atlanteans be in Antarctica now?
Antarctica is important. We've done these shows, and there's going to be an important Antarctica show coming up. We're going to put it, so I'm not going to let too much of the cat out of this bag, but it'll, if you can follow the track that we've had with Berkner and some of the things that they just discovered in 58, which was the date that Cayce identified as being crucial. And then all of a sudden we have all the space stuff happening. And then we know that the deep freeze operations that we were engaged in with Antarctica were all space related. We got that information from John Warner's dad. That's real inside stuff there. So yes, there's a huge secret, and also when you get around things like the Piri Reis, Turkish admiral's map showing Antarctica as a continent with no ice on it, you can imagine some of the things going on there. There's some fascinating work on it, including the Two Planets book, which I'm going to be presenting. But I will say this in relation to Atlantis. When the mystery groups have consistently identified, along with Plato and others, who's also a mystery player in all this, that's between the Straits of Hercules, the Rock of Gibraltar there on one side, and the Gulf of Mexico on the other. That is where Atlantis was. Now, Atlantis, some of the discoveries that Cayce talked about when they had to leave or when the islands split up and things, the Atlantean culture moved into Africa. Some of the things they found in the Sahara are all identified in the Cayce works. They are the Atlanteans moving off. And the Mayan civilization, the pre-Mayan activity, the Inca, all those things are offshoots of this Atlantean, egress. Now, when you find advanced cultures in other places, we can say, well, Antarctica is Atlantis. Doesn't make sense because Atlantis is in this area. And when you have the shifting and everything else, there are incredible things that have taken place. Whatever was going on in Antarctica, they could have been a very advanced culture. It's just this thing that is being referenced here when Cayce is talking about Poseidia being where Bimini is. This is a great thing about the hot zone, which is we have the ability to get at this thing. Antarctica, unfortunately, is a very tight bubble around the news and information. Very few people can tell us what's going on there on the ground. There are some. But I think this is important to say that there are layers of these mysteries. Just like if we go looking for Lemuria, Mu, this whole area and the story around it. Well, what we get from the mystery schools telling us about Mu is that this was an advanced culture that is just a little bit before Atlantis, but also takes place simultaneously. But their culture goes down as the result of the cataclysm. And a lot of that comes into America and the other half goes into Asia. So, this is the way it's presented. So Atlantis, as we understand it, that's where the Atlantic name comes from and everything. It was right there as a continent right there in the middle of the Atlantic. Yes.
Okay. On a separate note, Joe Gallo says, watch the terrible Gods of Egypt movie the other day. One scroll shows tons of tunnels under the pyramid. Also, the Sphinx is alive in it. Any Cayce readings on tunnels under or more on the Sphinx? And Synthetic Nature says, can you ask DJ if Hawass could be a CIA plant? Since Hawass received his scholarship from Cayce's foundation, and since we know the CIA had infiltrated the foundation also.
Yeah. I think it was the University of Pennsylvania where he got it, but they supported him. So they sponsored him, and they sponsored someone else named Mark Lehner, who lives up here. And those guys controlled the Giza Plateau for a number of years. Hawass, for a while, got thrown out. And, I had great stories from Carmen Bolter, the late Carmen Bolter, incredible filmmaker, researcher. And she told me remarkable things in relation to all this, but he weaseled his way back in now, and but he still doesn't have the control that he did. He was part of the Mubarak administration, which the military threw out because they were so corrupt. So how he could survive that? Yeah, his connections are just completely off the charts. Let's go here to talking about the Tuoi Stone and how it was misused. And then we're going to move into Besant, and then we'll take your questions.
Okay.
Okay, good. Let's try this.
Actually, since you just mentioned Carmen,
Mhm.
Martin Taylor asked earlier, DJ, what has happened to Carmen Bolter's Atlantis special film before her passing? Rest in peace.
Yeah, there's an incredible thing with Carmen. So she's shot 5 episodes of this special and went around the world to do it. There was a couple that was working with her, and I understand that her sister, had tried to find out and sort of set her affairs in order after the fact. But I haven't heard anything about it in probably 2 years now. So
It was finished, though, wasn't it?
it was close. There was a couple that was volunteering to work on it for her, and she told me that they very generously were doing this, and I believe they were in Florida, so it's probably very hard to bring it out. But if any of the people who were involved in that want to get in touch with me, and I can certainly suggest things or just be an advisor about how you might get it out. I would imagine there's some fascinating things in there, and she sounded very excited about it. As a matter of fact, my conversation with her had to be, I think it was like 3 weeks before she passed away. So you understand how shocking all that was. She was very excited about getting this thing out, and we already were talking about doing interviews and showing clips of the whole thing. So it must have been pretty close to being done. I'm gonna say then that that was 2019. No, uh, it was in 2020 because we were talking about COVID and how that had affected her travel plans. So yeah, extraordinary. And it's unfortunate, but she, my God, what incredible! She has an incredible legacy, the Pyramid Code that's there, and she really knew what was going on in relation to this. The Tuoi Stone. Let's get this on the record. I've talked about the Tuoi Stone, but I want it in this presentation. TUAOI. Cayce put the term out there, spelled out the words. He wanted this to be there. You can't find that in anyone else's work. There's something unusual about Cayce putting this out. You do find, I've looked into the term Tuoi, and in certain Samoan tribes they use the term. But what's interesting is if you look enough into the etymology of the term, you'll find out that basically when he's saying the Tuoi Stone, it means something like the people of the stone. And in this case, the people of the crystal. So that's what Tuoi represented. And at first they worshiped it because it did everything for them. And then, and they had this wonderful interface that it would magnetize stones. And then with those stones, they could interact with the saintly realms, and they would train the priestesses and the temples to do this. That's what the Amelius group was all about with the Tuoi technology. The Belial group takes it, and it becomes this incredibly vicious weapon. And so here's a little bit about that back and forth in that battle. And I think we're re-experiencing a lot of that Belial Amelius battle. So you can see how prescient this is. The preparation of this Tuoi stone was in the hands only of initiates at the time, and the entity was among those that directed the influence of the radiation that arose in the form of rays that were invisible to the eye, but that acted upon the stones themselves as set in the motivating forces, whether the aircraft that were lifted by the gases of the period, or whether the guiding of the pleasure vehicles that might pass along close to the earth, or what would be termed the crafts of the water or underwater craft. They had them all. Not only that, but he mentions if you go deep enough in those readings, they had craft that could go through things. They go through mountains, figure that one out. These then were impelled by the concentrating of the rays from the stone that was centered in the middle of the power station, or powerhouse as would be termed. So it's a Tuoi power station. In the active forces of these, the entity brought destructive forces by the setting up in various portions of the land the character that was to act as producing the powers in various forms of the people's activities in the cities, countries, and towns surrounding same. These forces, not intentionally, were tuned too high and brought the second period of destructive forces to the peoples of the land and broke up the land into the isles that later became the periods when the further destructive forces were brought to the land. Now, he mentions that it's the Belial group that's in charge, and that this person in their previous life joined with the Belial group in the final destruction of the land. And what's interesting is that second period of destruction that takes place is what we know as the Noah's flood. It was unintentionally set up by this group that was overdoing it with the Tuoi Stone, the Belial group, and they set off all these earthquake and inundations, and you got this worldwide flood as a result. So the Noah story comes directly out of that. But guess what? I have another date for you for this. 22,002 BC. That's where Cayce is giving the Noah Great Flood date. So now we have some dates to work with. 50,722 BC, huge destruction because they were trying to get rid of these beasts with the death ray, and instead the Belial group hijacks the technology, splits the island into three. Then you've got a different, further down the timeline, you've got this 22,000 BC destruction, and that is the Noah flood destruction. Those are some dates for you. And let's see here. I could go deeper on these, but I wanted to give that actual date on the Noah thing. So I'm going to read that, and then we're going to read Besant. Okay. In relation to the history of Atlantis as presented, at what period did the flood as recorded in the Bible in which Noah took part occur? This is crucial. In the second of the eruptions, Cayce said, in the second of the eruptions, or as is seen 2006, 2206, before the Prince of Peace, as time is counted now in light years, day and night years, not light years of the Akashic record. But so there's your time piece there. 2206 BC is when the Noah flood takes place. That comes directly out of the Cayce readings. Now, let's take a look at something which is right around this period of time. Unusual things are happening when Cayce is giving these readings. One is that the Sphinx itself is showing up in different displays. I found it at Caltech. I found this at the University of Pennsylvania, and they had brought over these various sphinxes and things. There was something going on under the surface, behind the scenes, about the Sphinx, and people were aware of it, and I think they were responding to it. This is what Cayce is giving us that piece. Before all this happens, we have the development of the Theosophical Society, and Blavatsky, when she develops the Theosophical Society, all kinds of things happen, and she's able to develop this incredible spiritual foundation, and all of these things ripple into the culture, including her book Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine. But the person she turns it over to is Annie Besant, and Besant is a social activist, a journalist, and all these things. She started off as a very proper Victorian woman, and what she was seeing were these groups of girls that were forced to work at young ages in these dangerous chemical factories and coming out with all these defects and things. That's where she makes her stand and really makes her mark. So she had a natural social sensibility about justice. When we get to Annie Besant, we're not talking about somebody who's just a lofty dreamer in relation to spiritual
she's
things.
an activist.
She was pretty hardcore, and the outcome of her activism ultimately is the home rule of India that takes place under Gandhi, who she was, gave him instruction for years about it. And she also was very involved with home rule in relation to Ireland. In any case, she takes over the Theosophical Society, and with Henry Alcott, they will take it up to a dramatic new level. There's a huge X piece about the ceremonies and things that they did. So if you're looking for that X steganography piece, Besant's version of anthroposophy has it for you, of theosophy. She did help set up anthroposophy, oddly enough, by giving Rudolf Steiner the German chapter of the Theosophical Society. Once she and the other leader of theosophy, C.W. Ledbetter, set up, Krishnamurti was a young Hindu boy at the time, a Hindu teenager. They were going to purify and have, be the Christ vehicle and all this stuff. And Lord Maitreya, the world teacher, would come through him. That's when Steiner said, this version of theosophy is nothing like the original. But he had high regard for Besant, and he was disappointed to see them take this. He wasn't a big fan of Ledbetter, but in any case, here's just a little bit of Besant talking here about the airships in the period of Atlantis, and the Poseidian piece comes up as well. And she's talking about, there are all these towns and plains that the Toltecs built up, and she's talking about how advanced they were And she's describing their cities, and she's saying between the earthworks and the barriers filled with earth, they were rammed together. The whole formed a practically impregnable barrier against the spears, swords, and bow and arrows from the usual weapons of the time. But such a city necessarily lay open to assaults from above, and the Atlanteans carried out with the making of airships, aeroplanes, we should call them now, to a high pitch of excellence. And if such a city were to be attacked, the birds of war were sent over it to drop into it bombs which burst in the air and discharged a rain of heavy, poisonous vapor destruction of human life. Allusions to these conflicts may be found in the great epics of the Hindus. They also had the weapons which projected these fire that scattered far and wide as they hurtled through the air like deadly rockets, and many other kinds of constructed by men that were well versed in the higher branches of scientific knowledge, the Atlanteans. Many of these are described in the very ancient books above referred to. So this is one of those demonstrations of the Belial group and how they were feared, which is they could attack things from the air. These other people didn't even have the ability of flight. The Atlanteans had it. So she's describing now something that sounds exactly what Cayce was talking about with the Tuoi Stones, this power station that they would use in order to help plants grow and animals to be healthy and things like that. Rays of sunshine sent through colored glass were used for promoting the growth of plants, animals. Scientific breeding was carefully carried out for the improvement of promising species. Experiments were tried in crossing of wheat and various grasses and produced different kinds of grain, which they were able to feed the populations with. So real, advances. And then she says the development for propulsion of both air and water ships. And so changing the relationship of heavy bodies to the earth. Some of the remarkable things, and the book where Besant talks so much about this is Man, Whence, How, and Whither, a record of clairvoyant investigation. She talks about the first, second, and root races on the earth were going on before Mars was deserted. There's an interesting crisscross here that I want to bring up that gets us into the field of why the UFO file needs to be understood so much as not just a straight up off-world phenomena. And, part of this can be difficult to clarify, but think of it this way. These groups went through different migrations and developed themselves on Mars, developed themselves on the moon. And then these groups come into Earth and inhabit the Earth. So they're creating themselves etheric and spiritual bodies, and then they come to the Earth and inhabit a physical body. So when they come here from Mars, they're coming here as a life wave. So the idea that we might think right off the bat, they're coming here in ships and the Martians land and they integrate into the culture. It's different. They actually come in as soul groups. But interestingly enough, here she is saying, although she's saying, she's not saying, well, there's people who are alive on Mars right now. No, but she's saying that in the early periods of human development, there was a living culture on Mars. I think that that's very interesting to come out and should be explored even further. She also talks over and over again about blue people, and they're the advanced initiates in that Atlantean period. And we see this with Krishna depicted as blue. Where did that blue aspect go, and how does it fit in with the rest of this? Well, we're going to go deeper with you, but tonight we're going to take your questions because at this point with the special report, we'll just try to weave it in with your questions. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm turning it over to you.
That's a perfect moment for me to ask this question or say this comment. Happy Hermit 3D says Tuoi, and it's spelled Touaoi, means far blue in Japanese.
Wasn't that interesting?
Yeah. And I'm absolutely thinking about the blue roofs and
oh yeah, wasn't it interesting that as soon as we did Blue Enigma and brought a lot of those things out, things in the world started showing up. And this is what happens sometimes with the X series, is it crisscrosses directly in the path. It's almost like a switch gets turned on and everyone becomes aware of this one particular thing. But a lot of the blue thing around the Maui fires was very unusual. And what we brought forward had to do with how UFO secrecy was adopting the uh, Masonic blue code, the Blue Lodge code of secrecy. And that's where you get the whole thing about Blue Book and all the rest of it. And we have more to bring forward about Blue Enigma. It's being prepped, shall we say. Yes, what do you got?
Fruber Fighter says blue people have copper instead of iron in their blood. Neil Lemuria says, who are the Amelius group communicating with the Tuoi Stone, utilizing it?
Who are they?
Yes. No, who are they? Who are the Amelius group communicating with?
Oh, Cayce talks about them and he refers to it as the saintly realm. So we're talking about advanced disembodied spirits being able to interface directly with, this higher group. They would prepare and purify the priestesses who would do it. And what's interesting, you had initiates running it, but all the information that I have in relation to how the Tuoi Stone was used like this was that it's almost exclusively women. And it's fascinating because when you get into things like the Judaism and things like that, or you get into the Old Testament, everything is swung over, and the men are running the priesthoods, and women are in a completely demoted state. So, but if you go back into that Atlantean period, when you're looking at the Atlanteans training priestesses to do this, so the men would be initiates. It's not like there weren't priests, but I noticed that Cayce is always referring when it comes to the ceremonies around the Tuoi Stone, not the technology part, but when they're doing this interface with the saintly realm, it's priestesses that they're using. So there's something about women using the Tuoi Stone. And for me, see, the Tuoi Stone is very interesting because in the period that we're in with the technology, people who are aware can see the downfall and the downsides of the technology. But apparently, of course, the technology itself could be tuned high, and the way that they were using it on the Amelia side was interfacing with spiritual powers. Well, we don't really hear anything about that with the technology that we have. We hear about being more efficient and, all these types of things. But spiritual technology, moral technology is something that comes up in the work of Rudolf Steiner. And he also talked about, and we did an episode on John Keeley, the psychic airships, which was X Series 165 a couple of weeks ago. And that episode has this whole section about how literally Steiner's saying, this stuff won't work. So people have to be trained for it. It reminds me very much of the government trying hard to get psychics to fly UFOs because they can't redevelop some of that technology because it requires, on a certain level, it requires this heightened psychic intuitive ability to run it. That explains a great deal of the government intelligence community interest in psychic development as a tool. And that's something which the public keeps, as a kind of a ridicule factor. But in the background, we know they're developing technology that can read your mind, so yeah. What's the real story?
Okay, so I have a set here. Food
Yes.
Provider, does DJ think Cayce was the equivalent of possessed, even if by benevolent spirits?
No.
Okay, Mary Marquis, Cayce kept his vibration high to thwart demonic possession.
Mhm.
And Roger Z says, I don't like the word psychic. Edgar Cayce was a trance medium. He had to be put under a trance in order for him to read anything. Steiner was clairvoyant, seeing by the clear light of day. Could you distinguish how Cayce read?
Well, I mean, Cayce talks about psychic forces. Plus, when he was awake, he had all kinds of psychic things. He saw auras, for example. He could read if somebody had a particular ailment, he could see it in their aura. He could also read their future in their aura. So there's all kinds of conscious abilities. What Cayce did, and it's very interesting, the process the reason he could really go deeper, and let's face it, had more reliable information than most psychics, is because he was able to literally separate himself out, go into this deeper place, get the information, and bring it back. In order to do that, you have to kind of let go of your entire personality, identity structure, and go and do it. And one of the explanations in the readings I always found fascinating was when he was a Persian leader named Yolt, and he gets shot by an arrow and he's wasting away there in the desert. He wills himself out of his body, basically willing himself to die. And so he creates the ability to leave his body at will in that lifetime. So when he comes in this time, it's a little more of a skill, intuitively. So if you think about his life as Rata, he's already, God knows what's going on there with Rata because, as a daughter of Zu, there's no human father. So we don't know what kind of a being is this. This is a super sensible being. But then if you take his earthly lives after Rata, Yolt has, he has some incredible abilities, but this moving his consciousness out of his body by will will come in very handy when he's Cayce. So in terms of possession, no, there's a lot of warnings about how to avoid possession in the Cayce readings. And very often possession is attributed to drugs or alcohol. So I find that very interesting. And let's face it, we've all known people who, when they're on drugs or alcohol, seem like they're possessed. So yeah, go for it. Wait,
Pepper.
before we go any further, if you're new here, everyone, first off, you're watching Dark Journalist Atlantis Rising Special, The Hot Zone, Edgar Cayce's vision of Earth changes and Poseidia rising. Go to darkjournalist.com if you haven't already. Sign up for our free newsletter that keeps us in touch, because that's how we're going to be able to keep in touch through the intense censorship that we're going through. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Ogham 5. Can DJ clarify whether Cayce indicates in his readings whether there was a full axial tilt or just massive crustal sliding?
Coming up or in previous times?
Good question.
Yeah, he talks about a pole shift, a full pole shift that took place just before Atlantis. So we know that he envisioned a period coming up that he said was a gradual pole shift, but he talked about Earth changes, and this is the thing. Actually, glad you mentioned that, because I'm going to read a couple of the Earth changes he warned us about that are coming up or can be avoided or should be at least on the map, as it were. As to the conditions for the geography of the world, of the country, changes here are gradually coming about. Many portions in the East Coast will be disturbed, America, as well as many portions of the West Coast, as well as the central portion of the U.S. In the next times, there will appear in the Atlantic as well as in the Pacific what is the coastline now of many a land will be a bed of ocean. Even many of the battlefields of the present 1941 will be ocean. Will be the seas, the bays, the lands over which the new order will carry on their trade one with another. So if you think about a lot of those, like the upper portion of Europe changing in the twinkling of an eye, this is what he's envisioning. Portions of the now east coast of New York or New York City itself will in the main disappear. You think about the enormous problems facing it. I find that's very interesting. Although he had a dream that he'd been reborn in 2100 AD and went to New York, and it was being rebuilt after a war or an earthquake. So it's interesting to say maybe something saves it. And then he says, New York City in itself in the main disappear. This will be another generation, though. The southern portions of Carolina and Georgia, these will disappear, but this will be sooner, much sooner. So that's an interesting one for us, I would say, to put on the map. The waters of the Great Lakes will empty into the Gulf of Mexico. The area where the entity is now located, Virginia Beach, will be among the safety lands when all this is taking place, as will be portions of now Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and much of the southern portion of Canada and the eastern portion of Canada and the western land. Much of that is to be disturbed in this land, as of course much in other lands. So these are coming. This is, something which I think people put an overemphasis on, and they were like, California's going underwater. Cayce said it was going to happen. He's indicating the trends to us, but what's happening is he's reading it out over time. And we'll find with a lot of people around Atlantis rising or earthquakes or earth changes, they thought this is going to happen in my lifetime. But he's not giving the information out that way. Some of the things were applied directly to their lifetime, but he was giving you the pattern, and he wasn't saying this is a prediction that's going to come true no matter what, but he's giving us indications that just as things are rising in certain areas, like you're going to see the rising of Poseidian temples, you're going to see lands going down and going under. This, for me, the earth changes part is crucial, and this is what is going on the leadership level, which is they're aware of this, and they've studied the data, not only esoterically, but they've correlated it, I'm sure, astronomically and otherwise, to indicate, well, what will be favorable and all the rest. In my opinion, they're doing that incorrectly, because if they were concentrating on themselves and expanding themselves and moving the culture forward, then they'd be in the right place at the right time. Instead, they're trying to drill it down into a function. And as part of that function, I believe when they do things like the COVID op, they are testing out things. If there's a series of earthquakes, how do we grab control? How do we introduce emergency powers? Locking down an entire culture was a dry run towards establishment of an entire continuity of government emergency powers situation. Well, earth changes would certainly give you the cue to do that, as would things that they can create, like things we talk about in this program. The UFO threat, for example, that would give you emergency powers. Nuclear threat, cyber terrorism, things of this nature. So you can, if you read the material, you can see we're getting a hint that there's going to be large scale earth changes. There's going to be earthquakes. There's going to be eruptions, and I think that those people are figuring, as these things change, how do they stay in power? And they're probably studying the very same things we are. Yes.
Eva Lundborg. Did Edgar Cayce talk about the civilizations before Atlantis? And Nena says, will DJ cover Churchward writing about Mu, I wonder? I dreamt some symbols and only found them in his chapter on the language of Mu.
Churchward was the first, really hardcore person to put Mu on the map. There had been suggestions in theosophical literature. I was reading, I wonder if I have it here. I was reading one of the theosophical books on Lemuria, and but Churchward had kind of derived this information from these various Eastern temples and things that had kept books. And Blavatsky had mentioned this as well, which is a lot of those mystery schools in the East having escaped. This is why I think the Nazis and the Chinese were so hardcore on Tibet. Not only did they want the power grab, but they wanted that whole structure. They wanted all the information that they knew, all their secret hiding places, the Shambhala texts, things of that nature. So yeah, we have to be aware of that. There's a few different moves in the background around this. Yes. What do you have?
Nothing. I didn't know you were. You were
well, the other part
so
of that about going back in time beyond Atlantis. Cayce talks about the first, coming in of the spirit of humanity into the earth. And so there's a lot of mention about that, but what he's describing there are not people as we know them. We're still in spirit hovering over things. And even in Atlantis, they're starting to be encased. And it is, in his work, it's Emilius. Emilius is Adam, and Emilius sets the tone for humanity. And it's interesting because he often talks about Emilius and then Emilius as Adam and then Adam. So it's like somehow there's a series of incarnations there that represent the same person. And he also suggests that Emilius is Jesus, so that in the process of reincarnating, he goes through all these various steps to give us a pathway to develop spiritually over time. It's a pattern, then, starting with our descent into Atlantis, and then he helps, the Emilius entity sets up a pathway for humanity, and then finally fulfills it by going through all the same things that humanity does through a series of 30 lives, and then showing up as Jesus, and then Christ inhabiting Jesus when he's 30 for his 3 years of ministry. And so it is the merging of, in an esoteric sense, it's the merging of humanity with the archangelic solar realm. So that's a kind of a cosmological treatment of the whole thing. Yes.
Okay. Nana says, what are the chances that Atlanteans were the giants, a civilization that had and used genetic manipulation? And Mari Mosef, are the Basque people of northern Spain remnants of the survivors of Atlantis? The X and ill sounds of their language are said to possibly be from the Aztecs, common people at a time?
Look, the Basque are incredible. We've put this on the record in a series of shows. There's very unusual history. Cayce identified directly that the survivors of Atlantis who went to the Pyrenees become the Basque, and their language is totally different. Their culture is totally different. Their look is totally different from everything that's in that area. There's no question that that's an Atlantean offshoot group. And for me, when you look at how this all plays out over time, you're looking at a group that becomes incredibly powerful. So the Atlanteans, we have to look at them as the height of humanity and what it could do. They could control things with their mind. They could build with their mind. They could levitate things with their mind. They could travel with their mind. There's a certain point where Cayce says they could go anywhere in the universe. So they're the most advanced group as humans that we've ever had. So when they come back in this period of the 20th century, when they start reincarnating, they again have the ability to set off these dramatic changes. So you start the century off with a horse and buggy, and by the 1960s, you're going to the moon, right? So we're in that phase and facing up to ourselves again in Atlantis. The crucial thing is the groups on the inside who've carried the information needed some outlet publicly for getting this out to people as information, as a warning for the larger culture, because after all, they're guardians of humanity. And so when you see the things that took place with Blavatsky and Besant and Steiner, Gurdjieff's work, Edgar Cayce's work, and I would say the same strain is in Manly P. Hall. He's more public. I would say they're still working with more secret sources, but there's a lot there that's giving us hints that there's something in terms of the spiritual development of humanity that we're at a crux, and that this whole development of the technology is facing ourselves from a different period when we created this incredible advancement but destroyed everything, and created this apotheum effect in Atlantis, which is where so many of the things that we study on this program about X-steganography, why those mystery schools kept steganography and used the secrecy of the symbol, and why that shows up in the 20th century and the 21st century, moving secret projects through government agencies that have to do with advanced technology. These things are related because those people know about the very same things that we're talking about here tonight. That's the advanced technology. It's a very ancient subject, in fact. Yes, Miss
Okay,
Olivia.
David Termina wanted to add the actor who portrayed Lex Luthor was Kevin Spacey. Also, DJ, do you suspect that lasers from space are being used currently? Is this behavior a revival of the Atlantean catastrophic land destruction? Did you hear Biden reference having the correct roof?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, there's a number of things that have been in place about space. And so a lot of the groups, I think, that were mystery groups, the secret societies also were involved with the space stuff, not just people who wanted to advance things culturally and spiritually, but these other groups who want to use space as a ritual domain and a power control center and things of this nature. So we had a heavy heap of that in Nazi Germany that got integrated into our space program. And the things that have been developments, we just saw these, the American moon lander lands on the moon. It's not manned, but we land something on the moon for the first time in 52 years. Well, what happened to the 52 years in between? That's the obvious question. But that thing falls over on its side and it's basically a failed mission. Well, that's interesting. That's, again, the public version of the program is failing. Well, a Japanese version, they launched to the moon, it goes on its side and that's not communicating. So there's something unusual about the space static and the news around space, including the Artemis program, which is supposed to kick off at the end of 2024. Yet it doesn't really feel like it, does it? It doesn't feel like there's any excitement about it. And I mean, it's not mentioned very much, that's for sure, or else I would certainly hear more about it since I look for that kind of information. So there's a great deal going on in space, and that infrastructure has been built up. Um, there are a lot of problems. And, we talk about the secret space program, we talk about artifacts in space. There's a lot of things that the average person um, has been kept in the dark about. And so much of this is, how do you let this out? And then again, they're considering things on the side of apotheum, which is that apotheum is this effect that's inside the X technology, but it also shows up with the UFO um, appearances, and that is physics change. And they haven't decided completely that they can control this, and so they still have this X Protect group running it, and they're still bringing in that apotheum side, because the apotheum side is the thing that they are afraid of. Because again, you know that kind of thing, the torsion physics, it makes the atomic bomb seem like a firecracker, right? So the last word we have on it from any kind of official source was when Robert Sarbarker said the UFO file is cataloged above, it's placed above nuclear secrecy. Well, that lets you know a great deal. Um, so, I happen to believe the things that they discovered in Tesla's work also operate completely on that apotheum level as well. So, you get problems into the rule of the world, into who has this and who is able to work with it and manipulate it. That's why you get so much subterfuge around the UFO file, because it's wrapped up. All you have to do to really understand the UFO file is read the contactee cases and read the various things that take place with them, including floating through walls and stopped time, time reversal, all these different things. They're not in normal physics, everyday reality like we are. And it's funny, I want to make this comment too, that you see a lot of people who are physicists, and I get emails from a lot of these guys. There's one guy who wanted to brag to me that he knew everything about UFOs, and why people don't just bow down and worship him for his knowledge of UFOs, and how he, with his great knowledge, had gone out with all these Hollywood starlets, things like that. And we get some eccentrics who are people who are in physics, and it gets really out there. So just because you have an expertise in one particular area doesn't grant you a subject. I saw Eric Weinstein on one of these programs, and this is a guy that they tout around. I'm telling you, there's so much to this, which is the whole Peter Thiel crowd moving these people into position to take over different things, to commandeer these posts about humanity and its origins, and then the alien question and all the rest. And the idea of bowing down before physicists when it comes to the UFO file, that's just one piece of how the entire thing works. Because, of course, people and their own intuition and interaction forms a whole cultural reference for UFOs. The technology forms one aspect. The interaction itself, the psychological impacts, they have nothing to do with physics at all. So this idea that somebody comes along with physics and understands everything about UFOs, and they have him out there saying, I'm the only one who knows anything about UFOs because of my physics knowledge. And so, I'm like, I'm the person to talk to about it. He doesn't know anything about it. As a matter of fact, until it became a New York Times topic, he never talked about it at all, like a lot of the Johnny-come-lately people. So in my opinion, people like John Mack, the late John Mack, and others who studied the experience of people involved with it were much closer than weird, egotistical physicists who are out there talking about it. Throw that stuff out. Throw it out with the CIA garbage, too. None of that stuff has anything to do with the UFO file. The UFO file cuts right down. The Apotheum thing gets you closest to it because it's a mix there of supernatural and advanced technology. Then you're getting into something. And it takes us to figure it out. It doesn't take, fine, there's a physics aspect to it. There's a psychological aspect to it. There's a psycho-spiritual aspect to it. It takes all these things, not just somebody who says, I know physics. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Atlantis Rising, Hot Zone, Edgar Cayce's vision of Earth changes, going deep, deep tonight. And we're going to wrap up tonight. We're going to take 2 more questions. And we're going to come into this subject deeply all year long because there's going to be a lot of revelations around Atlantis. And you're going to see a lot of this. What I want to put on the record in relation to this is the land rising part and how we need there's a great deficit in our knowledge base around this. And it's not talked about enough, not nearly enough. So let's really get into it there. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Hold on. Okay, here we go. So I wanted to make sure we had time to ask Jessica Rodriguez's question.
Yes.
Who wants to know which crystal or stone can be used to put on your forehead in between your eyebrows in order to help open up your third eye?
Well, it changes for different people. Isn't that interesting? Certainly there's a whole series of readings on gems and stones. There's a book, a very small book on gems and stones that come directly out of the Cayce readings. That is where I would point you for that. But certainly lapis lazuli was something that was spiritualized, according to Cayce. And it seems like, some of those aids on the stone side, quartz crystals, all the things, they help you to develop a rapport with that based on the fact that they resonate that way. And what's interesting also is, the process that takes place, when you are doing a gem and you polish it, what is that called? Where it's no longer in its raw state, but it is
like refined?
Yeah. Basically, Cayce's suggesting very often that it's you're better off with it in more of a raw state, and that polishing it down, into a wearable fashion is probably practical. But there's something about the unpolished stones which really maintain the potency. And I'm big on potency when it comes to information and when it comes to different things. But that's something I think to look into. But Gems and Stones would be the book. It's interesting because you reminded me, I wanted to read a quote before we leave about the things, because we're going to do a very important episode dealing with these Atlantean cyborg automatons, drawing on the Cayce and the Steiner work. And I'm going to read this quote, then we'll take the last question. How does that sound to you?
By the way, it's called lapping a stone. Isn't that interesting?
Lapping. Yes.
It's lapidary.
Yes. Very interesting. Okay. So Cayce gives us a snapshot here about that period when, Atlantis is going down and all the Atlanteans run directly to Egypt because they know this is going to be the place. And when they show up, the native population there is like, wait a minute, they're showing up and they're treating us like slaves because they're coming in with all these weird cyborg things and half animal, half man, half machine. And they come in with the automatons, and what's happening is they say, the automatons do all our labor and all this other stuff. And then they start ordering the Egyptians around like that. That's where you get the big civil war scene that he describes. So we'll just take a snapshot on this. This is the Rata period, 10,500 BC. The Atlanteans believed that all those of the things were without sufficient of the purposes to seek the whole light. Now, here's the thing. They were somewhat human. They had made them subhuman by these mixtures, but they still were human. So the Atlanteans were saying, well, they're not worthy to reincarnate and all the rest, and we can treat them as slaves because they're not really people. It sounds familiar, AI and all the rest of it, right? Cloning. Because of the very influences of the appendages and conditions which had been manifest in materiality, such as to make them things, were to be kept submerged to be used by those with the greater abilities. Rata, the priest, held that these were one, and that such conditions offered the possibilities through which each soul might find a way of escape by and through purifying the body of such experiences that are the activities of same. In its passage through the various experiences necessary, they might eventually become channels through which knowledge and blessing and divine influence and force might be made manifested. Many of the Atlanteans classified the natives as being hardly more advanced than their servants, for they had brought with them, as had the priest, many things or individuals or entities that were without purpose, or merely automatons to labor or act for the leaders in the various spheres of activity. And as the natives found, such beings were being classified or judged to be such as many of the natives of the land were also. So what the Atlanteans had done at that point was they had created the same types of things that we're endeavoring to create now. And you can see, and it's a delicate way to describe it, but some of the things they're doing around transhumanism that have to do with gender and switching people's genders and things of this nature, they're cutting them off from an actual tree of propagation in life. So they're creating a gallery of things, in outline, and that's they're going to go a lot further with it. But you can see the outlines of this, and there's an occult structure to that also, of course, because there's big occult structure around gender. So we need to be very aware of that in terms scientifically of the motivations and where these people are coming from. They're coming out of an occult religion to do this. There's no practical purpose for it all at all. And so, we need to be aware of that and remember, if we study it, there are things on the record about what took place when it happened. They had created these human cyborg animal interfaces, just the same types of things that they're planning now. They've got the robot part ramped up. They've got the clone part ramped up. They've got the AI part ramped up. How long till they just start creating these integrated beings? I'm sure they already have for years. So we're facing the same kind of Atlantean dynamic again. We're right in the heart of it. So the question is, there is a reference. There's something left out there in those mystery traditions that we can pick up on. And, you can bring the intuitive and the mystic forward on this. That's why we're so lucky to have Gigi Young, for example. Gigi Young can take a look at that, and she can bring it in from a person observing it in the same era and things that we are, but she's also coming from this mystical point of view. So we have, we have people in our corner for this, as it were. Everyone, that was our Atlantis Rising
Hold
Hot
on,
Zone
we have one
special
more
report.
question.
Oh, yes. Edgar Cayce's vision of Earth changes and Poseidia. I want to remind you, if you're new here, especially, it's such a great crowd in the Ideas Room tonight. Go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. The only thing that helps us in terms of getting around the censorship, which is heavy, and I mean heavy, and I don't say it lightly because, I don't bring things up. The censorship is heavy. And that's the best way for us to get around it. And we'll send you, once or twice a week, an email newsletter update about what's happening with the incredible documentaries. We just had one last week, Apotheum UFO File Wars. Incredible team working on that. And, I think it's got all the information there about Apotheum that you need, along with the history. X series episodes, yes, things that you will just blow your mind coming up, and events, which many of the steganography cinema pieces that we have are going to turn into live X series events. So you want to stand up and be counted. Make sure you're on that newsletter list and get behind the work that we're doing here by subscribing. We've made it very easy and accessible for you to do that. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question. You're up.
Okay. This is a package. Starseed 1776. Can the Belial group be seen as the same or similar to the Nephilim? Lindy T. Did the Belial group end up in Antarctica? Og Sauer 93 or inside Shasta? And Neo Lemuria, Belial have a higher concentration of reptilian DNA?
It's funny. I was reading something about reptilians, and it was in Besant's work. And I think one of the things that we miss, and what is helpful about theosophy and some of these people, is how they talk about the developmental periods in our history and how that is kind of thrown over, and everything becomes, oh, there's this alien group or that alien group. When in fact, what we need to find out is, how did these groups that were coming in different waves, and she speaks about the Lords of the Moon and things of this thing, how those groups became the guardians of humanity, and how humanity developed out of this, and how the different types came in through soul waves. Why is it that when Cayce refers to Atlantis over and over again, Arcturus and the Pleiades come up? This is very interesting to me. He's referring to the Atlanteans as exceptional in every way: spiritually, psychically, mental abilities, telepathy abilities. So, they are kind of alien in a sense, because they're super, they have these kind of supra normal abilities. And so I think that's a crucial piece to look at. Where did the Belial group go? Well, this is the interesting thing about the things, which we know. When some of the Belial group showed up in Egypt, they had all of these slaves with them. And then we hear about these other groups in the Cayce readings that went into America, and they have their things with them. So how does that aspect work itself out? Where does the technology go? Well, the technology goes under wraps, and it's only the initiates who handle it. And it's interesting because you can see, basically, they say, well, humanity destroyed itself with these great abilities. They can't handle it. So we're going to just keep it and transfer it generation to generation behind the scenes. But when you think about the priests in Egypt and everything else, and that the Hall of Records is there, those priests have access to the Hall of Records. They're aware of it. It's a secret that's handed down. So everyone in that mystery tradition in Egypt is very aware of the technology and the Atlantean aspect and all the rest of it. So somewhere in the lineage, I think, of those traditions, you find answers about how the Amelius group survived and how the Belial group survived. And I think they are a group that keeps coming back and reincarnating, and that's where you see the clash. So it's in their reincarnation, you see the next version of them coming in. And I think that there's tremendous, and I mean tremendous, evidence of Belial style activity in 2024. I think we're surrounded by it. And that is, for me, Cayce terms it Belial and Steiner terms it Ahrimanic. For me, they're the same thing, ultimately. And with that,
Can I ask you a question
sure.
about practically dealing with that? Because I find that people are still uh, d- still fearing too much. They haven't. They're beginning to step into their power and their courage.
Mm.
But what would you say Cayce would say about fighting evil, confronting evil, and stepping into your power as a sacred, divine being?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's so much in the Cayce readings that is spiritual. So that's kind of an easy one for how Cayce would approach it. And he lives in the heart, in the center of that oneness. I think ultimately the most important thing that all of these different teachers are stressing is that the nature of the outside, the demands of the outside world in this period are going to split people off into thinking purely in material terms. That's where they're going to see their real advancement and everything else. And it's going to take away that spiritual aspect. But in fact, their real power is deep in that spiritual side. So that's the thing that you need to kind of remind yourself about. So it's deep in the heart of the spiritual awareness is where your real strength comes from in a period like this. And I also think, we have to be careful as well, not to become, how can we put this, just negative when it comes to the judgment of the world. Remember, so many of the religious traditions teach us not to judge anything, right? Buddhism, Christianity, there's no judgment. That's the whole point. So we have to be very careful. We're being tempted and drawn into the system of judging things constantly. And, what you resent becomes kind of a part of you. So you have to be very careful with what takes place in that process. But I would say that there's a kind of an inner awareness that we need to cultivate, and that's our best weapon against the whole thing. And with that,
Can
Miss
I offer
Olivia,
a hack?
sure.
Okay, so as you know, before the show, I always pray, and sometimes I'm given incredibly
Mhm.
quick, direct advice. And tonight, it was very clear. It said, the mantra is, I am blessed. And it said, declare it. And it very strong. And this is the fastest hack to alignment with my higher self, my divine self, and to out of fear and into empowerment. If anybody wants to
Interesting.
try it, and it feels really good to say it.
Absolutely. Well, there's no question about it. And, I feel blessed to just be able to talk about these things and share them with you. I can tell you that when we discuss things in the X series ideas room, it doubles and triples and quadruples the effect and the impact of the ideas. And that's the very reason I think they try to shut discussions like this down. But we can definitely be very grateful we have the ability to move with these things, and that we have incredible people like Cayce and Besant and others who really, did a great deal to put this on the record and to give us something, who had a kind of nobility. And I think Steiner's work also gives us that foundation. And when we think about them as individuals, not just the kind of the myth created about them, or the sleeping wizard, or even Tesla. I mean, he's a human being who's bringing through, or I think he's human anyway, he's bringing through so many incredible things. And we have to remember that these archetypes of these incredible people, they were actually people, and they went through incredible struggles. I always remember the struggle of Hugh Cayce talking about coming from college and going to, when Cayce went to Ohio, and he had a lot of trouble when he went to Ohio. Things weren't going so great for him. And when he shows up to pick up his son, he's come back from college, he noticed that his dad has shoved newspaper inside of his clothing in order to keep warm. So, these weren't people living the lap of luxury, or, whatever it would be called. They suffered a great deal to bring forward the vision. And, we need to remember that if you think about it, Casey, basically died broke, but you can see the incredible legacy of the work that he gave in his own lifetime. But then here we are some 75 years later, and the ripples from that work just coming forward. It's incredible. It goes far beyond any sort of material gain, and yet it has all these incredible material achievements that we see. And then just think of the different minds and lives that are impacted by these people. It's remarkable. And we have that very same ability in little ways. And I can tell you, it's all one person and one day at a time with all of it. So fantastic. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Oh, I've got people to thank.
Yes.
I'm a little slow tonight.
No, you're
Hold
not.
on. Okay, I got lots of people to thank. Okay, Wolfgang McCarthy, Redcap Goblin, Medley Childress, The Bikini Truther, Empire of Light, Jay Parsons, Thermobsterful, Amarillo Gunrunners, Debbie Klinglesmith, Bella B, Terry Doherty, Robert Scott, Happy Camper, Eurythmia's Fun, Justin Ono, Charles Cheatham, Thomas Ball, Fulcanelli, C.A. Beffer-Forden, Christina Mystic, Bo Krills, Sarah Jane, Stephen Johnston. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, incredible. We really appreciate it. And of course, we couldn't do anything without our subscribers and our supporters. So to all our supporters and subscribers, make this show happen. Thank you. We'll be back with you next week. There's going to be a lot of Atlantis themes coming up. So as we get into spring, you're going to see a lot of very interesting things we're going to bring forward on this, including some very unusual things about the Sphinx that are starting to come out. And then I'm getting early word about. So we might have a lot there. And as I just mentioned last week, we did the Apotheum UFO special, the documentary there for you, heavily censored, but nonetheless, we've made it free and available for everyone. And I'm going to do some shout outs here before we go. And how about that Besant people were on Mars while they were developing here too? That was pretty interesting.
It feels right.
Igmu too. That's good. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. Thank you. Neo Lemuria, that's a great name. New. Gudrun Odin. Yes. Blue Man. We created the Ideas Room. Exactly. Original from the Dark Journalist family. Esoteric 369. Indeed, you've been there since the beginning. Makes a huge difference. Bo Krills. Lots of givers tonight. Indeed. Thanks, DJ, for talking about Edgar Cayce, the father of metaphysics. Yeah, it's interesting. He's also the father of holistic medicine. There's so many things that he recommended. Chiropractic, osteopath, homeopath. I mean, all that stuff just exploded long after he was around. Bill Ferry, it's good to see you out there, sir. There's a great deal about the Cayce subject, indeed. Christian Mystic, thank you very much. Thank you, DJ and Miss Olivia.
Joe Gallo would like more information about the Sphinx, but we've done shows about the Sphinx. Can you recommend one?
You know what? We're going to have a very interesting Sphinx show in April. So if you can, we certainly have some good shows there in the playlists on the X series dealing with the Sphinx, no question. But anything that has to do with the Hall of Records is going to be pretty wild. But the thing that we have coming up, probably make sure you're there for that. Also, I want everyone to put this date on their calendar. Are you ready? May 3rd. How about that? That's almost 2 months from now. Can you remember that date? May 3rd, a very special presentation here, right here in the X series. Just you wait. Esoteric, safe and effective. Musicians matter. David Tormina. Wait, he said something out loud that feels good. I missed what it was, though. We'll get it for sure. What else have we got here? Wayne Peak, Thomas Ball. Yes. Chuck Bam, Pumphrey Gooch. May 3rd, everybody. Save the date, 8 p.m. Eastern. An incredible presentation coming up for you. I know that's 2 months out, but hey. Plus, in about a month, the 6-year anniversary of the X Series show. They have meetups in Cambridge. Well, you're going to have an event. We're going to have some events this year you'll be able to come to. So yes is the answer. Just hang in there. And if you're on the newsletter list, you're going to see it. And Jessica Rodriguez, until next Friday, when the wisdom and knowledge never ends. Exactly. What a fantastic Ideas Room crowd tonight. We will see you all next week. And after all, it says end stream, but
Never really ends.
it never really ends. And never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot. And maybe we're looking at that coming back again. We shall see.